The autumn rain pelted the streets of London's exclusive Mayfair district as Ozzy Osbourne hurried down Bond Street on that grey October afternoon in 2010. The weather was particularly miserable, with heavy clouds overhead and a persistent drizzle that seemed to penetrate even the most expensive waterproof clothing. He was dressed casually in his typical offstage attire, worn jeans that had seen countless tours and recording sessions, scuffed leather boots that bore the marks of decades of performance, a faded Black Sabbath t-shirt from a tour in the 1980s, and an old leather jacket that had become as much a part of his identity as his distinctive voice. His long, greying hair was slightly dishevelled from the wind and rain, and he hadn't bothered to shave that morning, giving him the appearance of someone who might be more at home outside a working-class pub than walking through one of London's most expensive and exclusive shopping districts. To the casual observer, he looked like any number of aging rockers who might be found wandering the streets of Camden or hanging around music venues, certainly not like someone with the financial means to shop among the world's most prestigious luxury brands. Ozzy was on a mission that day, though one that was entirely out of character for the Prince of Darkness. His beloved wife Sharon's 60th birthday was approaching, a milestone that deserved something truly special and memorable. He wanted to surprise her with a piece of jewelry that would express his deep love and gratitude for everything she had done for him throughout their turbulent but enduring decades together. Sharon had stood by him through his wildest years, when his behavior was unpredictable and often dangerous. She had supported him through his battles with alcohol and drug addiction, managed his career when he was too intoxicated to make rational decisions, and nursed him through various health scares that would have broken a lesser relationship. She had been his manager, his protector, his conscience, and his anchor to reality when fame and excess threatened to destroy him completely. If you're enjoying this story so far, please consider leaving a like to show your support for stories about not judging others by their appearance and treating everyone with dignity and respect. As he walked past the gleaming storefronts of some of the world's most prestigious luxury brands, Cartier, Tiffany & Co., Harry Winston, and other names that represented the absolute pinnacle of craftsmanship and exclusivity, Ozzy felt increasingly out of place. The immaculate window displays showcased items worth more than most people's annual salaries, and the few other shoppers he could see through the rain-streaked glass looked like they belonged in a completely different world from his own. These were people who had been born into wealth and privilege, who moved through these rarefied spaces with the confidence that comes from knowing you belong. Their clothes were perfectly tailored, their hair was professionally styled, and their entire bearing suggested lives lived far removed from the struggles and uncertainties that had shaped Ozzy's early years in working-class Birmingham. He paused in front of Hartwell & Associates, one of London's most exclusive jewellery boutiques, an establishment with a reputation that stretched back over 2 centuries. The store was known throughout international high society for catering to royalty, celebrities, and the ultra-wealthy elite who could afford to commission one-of-a-kind pieces that would be passed down through generations. The store's reputation was absolutely legendary in certain circles. They had created tiaras for European royalty, engagement rings for Hollywood stars, and ceremonial pieces for heads of state. Their client list read like a who's who of international high society, and their craftsmen were considered among the finest in the world. Getting an appointment at Hartwell & Associates was nearly as difficult as purchasing one of their creations. The window display featured a stunning diamond necklace that seemed to capture and refract the grey daylight into 1,000 tiny rainbows, creating a display of beauty that caught the eye even on this dreary autumn day. The piece was clearly museum quality, the kind of jewellery that represented not just significant financial investment, but also generations of artisanal expertise and artistic vision. Ozzy knew immediately that this was exactly the kind of place where he might find something truly worthy of Sharon, something that would match her sophisticated taste, while also reflecting the unique and unconventional path their lives had taken together. She deserved something as extraordinary as the love they had built together through decades of triumph and chaos. Taking a deep breath and steeling himself for what he knew might be an uncomfortable experience based on past encounters in similar establishments, Ozzy pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped into the hushed, elegant interior of the boutique. The contrast between the noisy, wet street and the serene luxury of the store was immediate and jarring, like stepping from one world into another entirely. Soft classical music played in the background, something by Bach or Vivaldi that spoke of centuries of refined taste and cultural sophistication. The air was perfumed with an expensive scent that seemed to whisper of old money and inherited wealth, a fragrance that probably cost more per ounce than most people spent on their entire wardrobe. The interior was a masterpiece of understated elegance that spoke to generations of wealth and taste. Gleaming glass cases displayed an array of precious stones and metals that represented not just significant financial value, but also centuries of craftsmanship and artistry. Each piece was lit to perfection, creating an atmosphere that was both intimate and impressively grand. The walls were lined with rich mahogany paneling that had probably been installed when Queen Victoria was on the throne, and soft lighting created shadows and highlights that made even the most casual browser feel like they were in the presence of something truly special. Everything about the space was designed to make wealthy clients feel comfortable and important, while subtly reinforcing the exclusivity and prestige of the establishment. Behind the main counter stood an impeccably dressed man in his 40s, wearing a perfectly tailored Savile Row suit that probably cost more than most people earned in several months. The fabric was clearly the finest wool, cut with the kind of precision that only came from London's most exclusive tailors. His name, according to a small gold nameplate positioned prominently on the counter, was Reginald Pemberton, and everything about his bearing suggested someone who was not only accustomed to dealing with the upper echelons of society, but who considered himself to be part of that rarefied world. Pemberton's hair was perfectly styled with products that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine that could probably be seen from across the room, and his expression carried the kind of practiced politeness that barely masked a deep-seated sense of superiority and entitlement. This was clearly a man who believed that breeding and bank accounts were the true measures of human worth. Pemberton looked up as Ozzy entered, and his expression immediately shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed disdain and judgment. His eyes, cold and calculating, took in every detail of Ozzy's casual attire, his unkempt appearance, and his general demeanor, and made an instant determination about the kind of customer he was dealing with. "I'm sorry, sir," Pemberton said, his voice carrying the kind of upper-class accent that seemed specifically designed to intimidate and exclude. "But I'm afraid this establishment operates strictly by appointment only. Perhaps you might find what you're looking for at one of the shops on Oxford Street or in one of the shopping centres." The dismissal was polite in its wording, but unmistakably clear in its intent. Pemberton had decided, based solely on Ozzy's appearance and the assumptions that came with it, that he didn't belong in this rarefied environment and certainly couldn't afford anything they had to offer. The suggestion to try Oxford Street was particularly insulting, as it was clearly meant to direct him toward more pedestrian shopping options. Ozzy felt the familiar sting of being judged by his appearance, something he had experienced countless times throughout his life, despite his extraordinary success and wealth. Despite having sold over 100 million records worldwide, despite owning multiple homes worth millions of pounds, despite being one of the most recognizable figures in entertainment history, he had never lost his working-class roots or changed his casual style of dress. This was a deliberate choice on his part. He refused to let success turn him into someone he wasn't, refused to adopt the pretentious mannerisms and expensive uniforms that might have gained him easier acceptance in places like this. But the consequence was that he frequently found himself being underestimated or dismissed by people who couldn't see past the surface to understand who he really was. "Actually," Ozzy said calmly, his Birmingham accent contrasting sharply with Pemberton's refined tones, "I was hoping to look at some jewellery for my wife, something special for her birthday. I understand you have some exceptional pieces." Pemberton's smile became even more condescending, the kind of expression typically reserved for children who don't understand that they're asking for something impossible. "I see. Well, as I mentioned, we do require appointments for all viewings, and our pieces start at rather substantial price points. Perhaps I could recommend some other establishments that might be more suitable for your particular budget and needs." The implication was crystal clear and deliberately insulting. Someone who looked like Ozzy couldn't possibly afford anything in this store. Pemberton's assumption was based entirely on appearance, accent, and social prejudice, and his dismissive attitude was becoming increasingly obvious and offensive with each word he spoke. "What kind of price range are we talking about?" Ozzy asked, genuinely curious to see how far this man's arrogance and prejudice would go, and whether there was any limit to his willingness to make assumptions about customers based on their appearance. "Well," Pemberton said with a patronizing tone that suggested he was explaining something to someone of limited intelligence, "our entry-level pieces typically start around £10,000, and our signature collections, the pieces that serious collectors and connoisseurs are interested in, can range well into the six figures. I do hope you understand that we cater to a very specific and exclusive clientele." Ozzy nodded thoughtfully, maintaining his calm demeanor despite the obvious insults being directed his way. "Right, and that clientele would consist of exactly what kind of people?" "Individuals of substantial means and refined taste," Pemberton replied stiffly, clearly feeling that he was stating the obvious. "Royalty, heads of industry, international celebrities, politicians, people who understand and appreciate the finer things in life, people who move in certain circles and have the breeding to appreciate true craftsmanship." At this point, a younger employee, a woman in her 20s named Claire Morrison, had been listening to the conversation from across the store while pretending to organize inventory and update display cases. Something about the older man's voice was nagging at her, though she couldn't quite place why he seemed familiar. His accent was distinctive, and there was something about his presence that suggested he might be more than he appeared. Unlike her colleague, she hadn't immediately dismissed him based on his appearance, and she was growing increasingly uncomfortable with Pemberton's obviously prejudiced behavior. Having grown up in a working-class family herself before working her way up in the luxury retail industry, she understood how unfair and hurtful such treatment could be. "I see," Ozzy said, maintaining his calm demeanor despite the mounting insults. "And how exactly do you determine who belongs to this specific clientele? Is there some sort of dress code I should be aware of? A particular way one should speak or carry themselves?" Pemberton's face flushed slightly as he realized that he was being called out on his discriminatory behavior, but his arrogance and sense of superiority prevented him from backing down or acknowledging that his approach might be inappropriate. "Sir, I think it's quite obvious that there are certain standards and expectations in an establishment of this caliber." "That what?" Ozzy interrupted, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that suggested his patience was wearing thin. "That someone who doesn't look like your typical customer couldn't possibly afford your jewelry. That working-class accents automatically disqualify someone from shopping here. That you can determine someone's net worth by looking at their clothes." The tension in the store was becoming palpable, like electricity building before a thunderstorm. Claire had stopped pretending to work and was now openly watching the confrontation, her discomfort with her colleague's behavior evident on her face. She could see that this situation was heading toward disaster, and she was beginning to suspect that Pemberton had made a serious mistake in his assessment of this particular customer. "Sir, I really must insist that you understand our position," Pemberton began, but he was interrupted by Claire, who had finally placed why the customer's voice sounded so familiar and why his presence had seemed so significant from the moment he walked in. "Oh my God," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the quiet store. "You're Ozzy Osbourne." The effect of her words was immediate and dramatic, like a bomb exploding in the refined atmosphere of the boutique. Pemberton's face went from flushed with annoyance to completely pale with horror in a matter of seconds, and his entire demeanor changed as the realization of what he had just done hit him like a physical blow. Ozzy Osbourne was not just any celebrity. He was a rock legend worth tens of millions of pounds, someone who had sold over 100 million records worldwide, someone who regularly appeared on lists of the wealthiest musicians in Britain and the world. More importantly for Pemberton's immediate concerns, he was exactly the kind of high-profile client that Hartwell and Associates desperately wanted to attract and retain. The implications of what had just transpired began to sink in with terrifying clarity. Pemberton had not only insulted a potential customer who could afford to buy half the store without thinking twice, but he had done so in a way that could potentially damage the reputation of Hartwell and Associates if word of this treatment got out to the media or the entertainment industry. "Mr. Osbourne," Pemberton stammered, his previous arrogance completely evaporating like morning mist. I had no idea. Please accept my sincerest and most humble apologies for this terrible misunderstanding. I assure you that this is not representative of how we normally conduct business." But the damage had already been done, and Ozzy's expression made it clear that a simple apology wasn't going to undo the disrespect and discrimination he had experienced. The insult wasn't just personal. It represented everything he had fought against throughout his career. All the prejudice and class-based discrimination that he had encountered as a working-class kid trying to make it in the world. Misunderstanding, Ozzy repeated, his voice now carrying the full weight of his displeasure and the authority of someone who had commanded the attention of millions. What exactly was misunderstood here? You took one look at me and decided I didn't belong in your precious establishment based on nothing more than my clothes, my accent, and your own prejudiced assumptions about what success looks like. Pemberton was now sweating visibly, understanding that he had not only insulted a potential customer worth millions, but had potentially cost his store a significant sale and seriously damaged their reputation with one of the most recognizable figures in the entertainment industry. The story of this encounter could easily make its way into the gossip columns or social media, creating a public relations disaster for the boutique. Mr. Osbourne, please. I was simply trying to maintain the standards of the establishment. Pemberton began desperately, but his words only seemed to make the situation worse. To what? Ozzy interrupted, his voice rising slightly, but still maintaining the controlled authority that had made him one of the most commanding performers in rock history. To protect your precious store from the wrong sort of customer. To make sure that only people who look and sound exactly the right way are allowed to spend their money here. To perpetuate the kind of class-based discrimination that keeps working people feeling like they don't belong anywhere. Claire, meanwhile, had approached the conversation and was standing slightly behind Pemberton, her face showing a mixture of professional embarrassment at her colleague's behavior and genuine excitement. At meeting one of her musical heroes, she had grown up listening to Black Sabbath and Ozzy's solo work, and seeing him being treated so poorly made her both angry and mortified. Mr. Osbourne, she said respectfully, stepping forward with obvious courage, I am so deeply sorry for how you've been treated here today. Mr. Pemberton's behavior is completely unacceptable and doesn't represent the values that this establishment should stand for. I want you to know that not all of us share his attitudes or his approach to customer service. Ozzy looked at her with some surprise, not expecting to find an ally in this situation, especially not someone who was willing to speak up against a colleague in front of a customer. Thank you, he said simply, his tone warming slightly. At least someone here understands basic human decency and respect. Pemberton, desperate to salvage the situation and perhaps save his job, began falling over himself to make amends, his previous arrogance replaced by panicked servility. Mr. Osbourne, please, let me show you our finest pieces immediately. We have some absolutely stunning necklaces that would be perfect for Mrs. Osbourne. Perhaps something from our royal collection, or one of our custom pieces designed by our master craftsman. But Ozzy had already made up his mind about how he wanted to handle this situation, and his decision would prove to be both a lesson in dignity and a masterclass in how to respond to discrimination with grace rather than revenge. Actually, he said, looking directly at Claire while completely ignoring Pemberton, I'd prefer to work with someone who didn't judge me the moment I walked through the door. Someone who understands that respect should be the starting point of any business relationship, regardless of how a customer looks or sounds. Would you be able to help me find something special for my wife? Claire's face lit up with genuine pleasure and obvious relief that the situation might be salvaged. It would be an absolute honor, Mr. Osbourne. What kind of piece were you thinking about? Perhaps you could tell me something about Mrs. Osbourne's personal style and preferences. As Claire led Ozzy toward the display cases, explaining the various options available with knowledge and enthusiasm while treating him with the respect and professionalism that should have been offered from the beginning, Pemberton stood off to the side. He understood that he had not only lost what could have been one of the largest sales of his career, but had also revealed himself to be exactly the kind of snobby, prejudiced person that gave the luxury retail industry a reputation for being elitist and exclusionary. Over the next hour and a half, Claire proved to be everything that Pemberton was not: knowledgeable about the pieces in their collection, respectful in her approach, and genuinely interested in helping Ozzy find the perfect gift for Sharon. She listened carefully to his description of his wife's style preferences, asking thoughtful questions about Sharon's taste in jewelry and her lifestyle. She learned that Sharon preferred pieces that were elegant but not ostentatious, sophisticated but with a touch of unconventional flair that reflected her personality and their unique life together. Claire showed him several options, explaining the craftsmanship behind each piece and the stories of how they had been created. Eventually, they settled on a stunning diamond and emerald necklace that perfectly captured what Ozzy had been looking for. The piece was both elegant and distinctive, featuring a design that was classical in its proportions, but contemporary in its execution. The emeralds were a particularly beautiful shade of green that would complement Sharon's coloring perfectly, and the diamonds were flawless, each one carefully selected for its brilliance and fire. The price was substantial, nearly £60,000, but Ozzy didn't hesitate for a moment before agreeing to the purchase. For him, the cost was secondary to finding something that would properly express his love and appreciation for everything Sharon meant to him. As Claire processed the transaction, handling the paperwork with obvious care and attention to detail, while maintaining the kind of professional service that every customer deserved, Ozzy made sure to express his appreciation for her approach and her character. "You know," he said, "you've made what could have been a terrible experience into something actually pleasant and meaningful. Your colleague could learn a tremendous amount from you about how to treat people with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or background." Claire blushed with pride at the compliment, but her response showed the kind of character that had impressed Ozzy from the beginning. "Thank you, Mr. Osbourne. I have to say, I've been a fan of your music for years, and meeting you has been incredible. But more than that, I believe that everyone who walks through that door deserves to be treated with respect and courtesy. That's just basic human decency." When the transaction was complete and the necklace was being prepared for presentation in one of the store's elegant gift boxes, a work of art in itself that reflected the prestige of the establishment, Ozzy turned to address Pemberton directly. The man had been hovering nearby throughout the entire process, clearly hoping for some opportunity to redeem himself, but Ozzy's words were not what he was expecting. "I want you to understand something important," Ozzy said, his voice calm, but carrying unmistakable authority and the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I've been judged by my appearance my entire life, from the time I was a child growing up poor in Birmingham to this very day. When I was young, people looked at me and saw someone who would never amount to anything. When I started in music, they saw a working-class kid who didn't belong in their world. Even now, after everything I've achieved, people like you still look at me and see someone who doesn't deserve basic respect." Pemberton stood silent, unable to meet Ozzy's gaze, understanding that he was receiving a lesson that he should have learned long ago, but had somehow managed to avoid throughout his privileged life. "But here's what you need to understand," Ozzy continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone who had learned these lessons through decades of experience. "Every person who walks through that door deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, whether they're wearing a designer suit or clothes from a charity shop. You don't know people's stories, you don't know what they've been through, you don't know what they've achieved, and you certainly don't know what they're capable of accomplishing." The lesson was clear and powerful, and its impact was evident not just on Pemberton, but on Claire and the other employees who had gathered to listen to this impromptu masterclass in human dignity. "More importantly," Ozzy said, "treating people badly based on their appearance doesn't make you superior. It just makes you a small person with a small mind and a smaller heart. I hope this experience teaches you something important about the kind of person you want to be and the kind of world you want to live in." With that, Ozzy thanked Claire once more, accepted his beautifully wrapped purchase, and headed toward the door. But just before leaving, he turned back one final time to deliver a message that would be remembered long after he left. "Oh, and Pemberton," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of the commanding presence that had made him one of the most powerful performers in rock history. "You might want to rethink your entire approach to customer service and human interaction. In case you haven't noticed, the world is changing, and your attitude is exactly the kind of thing that gives places like this a reputation for being stuffy, irrelevant, and completely out of touch with reality." The story of Ozzy's experience at Hartwell & Associates spread quickly through London's entertainment and social circles, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions based on appearance and the importance of treating every customer with respect and dignity. Within days, it had reached the ears of the store's owners, who were mortified to learn how one of their employees had treated such a high-profile potential customer. The incident sparked immediate changes within the organization. Pemberton found himself undergoing mandatory sensitivity training and was ultimately moved to a position in the back office where he had no direct customer contact. Meanwhile, Claire was promoted to senior sales associate and became the store's primary liaison with celebrity and high-profile clients, a role for which her respectful and professional approach made her perfectly suited. The owners also implemented new training programs for all staff members, emphasizing the importance of treating every customer with respect, regardless of their appearance, accent, or perceived social status. The Ozzy Osbourne incident became a case study in their training materials, serving as a reminder of how prejudice and discrimination could damage both individual relationships and the reputation of the business. The incident also sparked broader conversations about class prejudice and customer service in London's luxury retail sector, with several industry publications using it as an example of how not to treat customers and the importance of training staff to provide excellent service to everyone. Business schools began using the case as an example of how personal prejudices could cost companies significant revenue and damage their reputations. For Ozzy, the experience served as yet another reminder that success and wealth don't automatically shield someone from prejudice and discrimination, but also reinforced his belief that standing up for principles and treating others with dignity is always the right choice, regardless of the circumstances or personal cost. Sharon loved the necklace, of course, understanding immediately that it represented not just Ozzy's love for her, but also his commitment to choosing beauty and elegance over ostentation or flash. But she was even more impressed by the story of how Ozzy had handled the situation with grace and used it as an opportunity to educate someone about respect and human dignity. "You know," she told him later, "you could have made that man's life absolutely miserable with just a phone call. You could have gotten him fired, damaged the store's reputation permanently, made it a huge public scandal that would have followed him for the rest of his career. But instead, you chose to teach him something important about being a better human being. That's the man I fell in love with all those years ago." The story became part of Ozzy's legend, another example of how the Prince of Darkness could be both formidable and compassionate, depending on the situation and what was called for. It proved that real strength isn't about intimidating others or using your power to crush people who disrespect you. It's about maintaining your dignity, standing up for what's right, and helping others learn to be better than they were. And somewhere in Birmingham, there are probably still working-class kids who dream of achieving something extraordinary, proving that where you come from and how you look has absolutely nothing to do with what you're capable of accomplishing with talent, determination, hard work, and a little bit of that indefinable magic that turns ordinary people into legends. If this story resonated with you and reminded you never to judge people by their appearance, please consider leaving a like. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of how they look or where they come from. Sometimes the most extraordinary people come in the most ordinary packages, and true class is measured by how you treat others, not by your bank account or your wardrobe.